I thought I knew the boundaries. I thought silence was safe. But then my wife left for a few days, and I was alone in the house with her father. What started as small talk became something else, something I couldn't explain and couldn't ignore. This isn't a story about what happened. It's about what almost did. I never imagined that a quiet evening in late October could shift the ground beneath my feet. But as the sun dipped behind the pine trees surrounding the Turner family home in Reed Ridge, Oregon, I found myself in unfamiliar emotional territory. My wife, Claire, was away on a week-long training retreat for work. Her mother had traveled to another state to visit a cousin recovering from surgery. That left just me and her father, Richard Hayes, under one roof, a man I respected but didn't know well beyond polite family dinners and obligatory conversations. Richard was a man of presence, tall, with silver-streaked hair and a quiet intensity that made most people sit straighter when he entered a room. He had been a respected architect in his prime and carried himself with the kind of authority that required no words. His silences spoke more than most people's full paragraphs. The first couple of days passed uneventfully. We exchanged brief updates about the weather and our schedules. He watched the news in the evenings. I buried myself in work. But silence has a strange way of stretching time when two people try to avoid anything deeper than surface-level talk. One evening after dinner, I found myself on the living room couch, flipping through channels without really watching anything. Richard came in with a drink in hand and took the armchair across from me. The light from the lamp cast soft shadows, and the air between us felt unusually dense, like a room filled with words neither of us wanted to say. We spoke about football, then local politics. Then the conversation dipped into a more personal place. It wasn't overt, but his comments grew slightly more reflective. He mentioned how much he appreciated people who lived with restraint, who kept their lives in order. It felt more pointed than usual. There was nothing wrong with the words, but it was the tone, the way he looked at me when he said them, the lingering eye contact. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A quiet current passed through the space between us. I chalked it up to my imagination. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But the tension didn't ease in the days that followed. If anything, it intensified. We kept finding ourselves in the same spaces, neither of us initiating it, yet somehow always ending up seated across one another. Every conversation felt layered, polite on the surface, loaded underneath. One night, after another evening of dancing around meaningful silence, I sat awake in the guest room. I replayed the small moments over and over. The way his gaze lingered, the way his voice slightly dropped when addressing me, the quiet moments when the silence between us felt full of meaning rather than empty. I wanted to believe it was just circumstantial, a product of loneliness, of awkward proximity. But deep down, I knew better. There was something there. It wasn't physical, not overt, but it lived in the way we navigated space, in the pauses between words. Still, we said nothing. The next day, I made a conscious effort to stay out of the house. I worked from a coffee shop in town, ran errands that didn't need to be done. Anything to avoid the silent weight pressing on my chest whenever we shared a room. That evening, however, it was unavoidable. He offered to make dinner, and I accepted. It felt wrong to refuse. The meal was quiet, pleasant, and uneventful until it wasn't. As we cleared the dishes, he mentioned how rare it was to connect with someone who truly understood silence. I paused. I didn't know what to say to that. Afterward, we sat again in the living room. The television played softly in the background. He sat a little closer this time. Not too close, just enough that I noticed. I tried to keep my focus on the screen, but I could feel his presence like heat. When I stood to leave, he looked up. He didn't stop me. He didn't say anything at all, but his gaze lingered just long enough that I felt it hours later, lying awake. Something unspoken had begun to take shape. A mutual awareness. A tension that neither of us knew how to name, but both of us could feel. It wasn't about action. It was about possibility. And that, in many ways, felt far more dangerous. By the time Claire returned, I had perfected the art of compartmentalization. Smiles, stories, routines, everything as it should be. But the silence between Richard and me had changed. It wasn't hostile, just loaded, like a room with the lights turned off, where you know something is there, even if you can't see it. Nothing had happened, and yet everything had, and I knew this was only the beginning. Claire's return brought a welcome layer of normalcy back to the Turner household. With her home, the rhythm of life fell back into place. Shared meals, soft conversations about work, and evenings spent planning the holidays. But beneath that comforting routine, I carried the quiet echo of the past week. Richard and I barely exchanged words in the days that followed. We shared space politely but cautiously, like dancers avoiding eye contact after hearing a song they both recognized but refused to name. It was safer that way. Easier. Claire didn't seem to notice anything unusual. If she sensed any shift, she didn't mention it. And I was grateful for that. I kept myself busy with work and home projects, anything to avoid long pauses or extended dinners that might tempt silence to start whispering again. A few days later, Claire was invited to a last-minute team retreat in the mountains. It would only be for the weekend, she said. I encouraged her to go. I think a part of me believed that whatever had stirred before might finally fade in her absence. But when she left, I felt the familiar tension return almost instantly. That strange energy, like static before a storm, crept back into the walls. I tried to spend most of Saturday away. I went to the farmer's market, walked the lake trail alone, even sat through a movie at the small downtown theater. But by the time I returned home, the sun was low and the house was humming with its usual quiet. Richard was there. Of course he was. And we were, again, the only two people in it. Dinner passed without incident. We made small talk about weather patterns and the price of lumber, a topic he always had opinions on. It was cordial, a perfectly average evening. But I could feel the tension building again, like the air had changed pressure. Later, I sat in the living room with a book in my lap, barely reading. Richard entered with a mug of tea and sat across from me, a bit closer than usual. Nothing inappropriate, but closer. He didn't speak. Neither did I. The silence settled between us like a weight. I tried to focus on the page in front of me, but I could feel his eyes move to me now and then. Not intrusive, not obvious, but present. It was the kind of attention you don't see directly, but sense anyway. It made my skin tighten and my mind wander. Eventually, he broke the silence with a simple question about my career path, how I ended up choosing what I did. It was a safe question, one Claire had asked me a dozen times. But the way he listened was different. Intent. Focused. I spoke carefully, choosing words that would close the door on anything deeper. He said something thoughtful in response. Something about how people rarely give themselves permission to want things they can't justify. I nodded, unsure if he meant it as a general observation or something more. That night, I lay awake again. It was the way he looked at me when I wasn't speaking, as if my silence said more than any of my answers. And I hated that a part of me didn't mind the attention. Sunday morning was slow. Claire wouldn't return until the evening. I busied myself with laundry and cleaning, anything to stay moving. Richard spent most of the day in the backyard, pruning a few overgrown hedges and sweeping the patio. We barely crossed paths. But after dinner, we ended up back in the living room. Same arrangement, different atmosphere. The silence now felt almost intentional, as if both of us were trying to see how long we could sit in it before someone spoke. He asked about Claire, about our plans for the future, about whether I felt settled in life. The questions weren't inappropriate, but they touched nerves I hadn't expected. I answered truthfully, if vaguely. He nodded thoughtfully, and then said something that stuck with me long after. Sometimes we find ourselves in spaces we didn't expect, and all we can do is decide what kind of person we want to be in them. I didn't respond. I didn't know how. When I went to bed that night, I didn't sleep right away. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, wondering why some conversations feel louder in silence than in speech. I wasn't sure where this was going, or if it was going anywhere at all. But the emotional distance I tried to build was already too fragile to rely on. And part of me was starting to wonder if I even wanted it to hold. Claire's return late Sunday evening was like a sudden change in weather. Comforting, grounding, but carrying its own subtle disturbances. Her presence filled the house again with warmth and familiar movement. I found solace in her stories from the retreat, her laughter in the kitchen, her hand brushing mine as we washed dishes together. For a while, almost worked. The distance I'd built, the walls I'd erected in my mind, seemed to serve their purpose. I clung to them, grateful for their protection. Richard, too, retreated. He remained polite, present, but distant. Conversations became brief again. The lingering silences, the careful glances, they faded back into shadows. Or at least I told myself they did. A week passed in this delicate balance. But nothing that deep ever truly disappears. It just waits. It happened during a quiet Wednesday evening. Claire had gone to bed early with a migraine. I stayed up to finish grading some reports in the dining room. The house was still, the kind of stillness that amplifies every creak and shift in the woodwork. I heard Richard enter the kitchen behind me. The sound of the refrigerator door opening, the gentle clink of ice in a glass. I didn't turn around, but I felt it, that subtle shift in atmosphere, the moment a room becomes charged without explanation. He paused in the doorway before speaking. Long night. I nodded without looking up, just trying to finish a few things. Don't let her migraine guilt you into overworking. His tone was light, almost amused. I finally glanced up. He stood there, relaxed, glass in hand, watching me the way someone might watch a fire. Calm on the outside, contemplative underneath. Just catching up, I said. My voice felt too loud in the silence. He gave a slight nod and turned away, but not before holding my gaze for just a moment too long. It was nothing, and yet not nothing at all. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing footsteps that might have been echoes or my imagination. I kept thinking of his voice, the way he looked at me across the threshold, like a question he hadn't asked out loud. The next morning, Claire was already gone for work when I came downstairs. Richard sat at the kitchen table with the paper, coffee steaming beside him. He looked up and nodded. No words passed between us. I made my coffee in silence and sat at the opposite end of the table. The distance felt intentional. He folded the paper slowly and placed it aside. Then he said, "It's hard, sometimes, being aware of things you can't say." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just stirred my coffee and stared at the window. We didn't speak again for the rest of the day. The weekend approached. Claire suggested a family dinner, just the three of us. Something easy and familiar. I agreed without hesitation. Part of me longed for normalcy, for a table where nothing unspoken lingered. She made pasta. We set the table together, laughed at an old memory. It was good. It felt almost real. But during the meal, I reached for the wine bottle, and my hand accidentally brushed Richard's. A brief moment, a flash of something electric. I pulled away quickly, pretending not to notice. But I did, and so did he. After dinner, Claire took a phone call from her sister and stepped into the next room. The silence that followed was too familiar. Richard stood slowly and began collecting plates. "You don't have to," I started, but he waved it off. As we stood by the sink, rinsing dishes under the warm tap, the quiet between us tightened. "Whatever this is," he said softly, not looking at me, "I don't expect you to understand it, or even accept it." I swallowed hard. Nothing's happened. He looked at me then. Calm. Certain. That doesn't mean nothing's real. I didn't know what to say. Every word I considered felt like a betrayal. To Claire, to my own sense of order. When Claire re-entered the kitchen, the tension dissolved in an instant. We became three people again. A family. Smiling. Finishing dishes. As if nothing had changed. But everything had. That night, lying next to Claire, I felt the weight of two truths pressing against each other. One I lived in. The other I tried to silence. The days that followed were filled with small distractions. Work deadlines, grocery runs, calls with family. I leaned into each task like a lifeline, trying to anchor myself in the ordinary. But even the most mundane routines couldn't quiet the noise beneath the surface. Richard and I had returned to silence, but not the safe kind. Now, every glance across the room, every shared space, felt like walking a narrow bridge in the dark. Claire remained oblivious, or perhaps simply chose not to see what she couldn't name. One evening, She mentioned an upcoming conference in Seattle. It was an opportunity she didn't want to miss, but it meant being away again for several days. I encouraged her to go, told her we'd be fine. I even meant it. At least, part of me did. When she left, the house changed. Not physically, the same furniture, the same quiet hum of the heating system, but the energy shifted. Richard and I moved around each other like opposite ends of a magnet, always aware, never touching. We barely spoke, but silence has a gravity of its own. It pulls. On the second evening of Claire's absence, I stayed late at the office. I told myself it was for the workload, but I knew it was more than that. By the time I got home, it was already dark. I found a plate of food waiting for me on the counter. Covered, still warm. I ate in silence, then moved to the living room with a book I never opened. Richard was already there, seated in his usual chair. He didn't speak, and neither did I. But we stayed there, the television humming in the background. Eventually, he stood, paused near the hallway. "Good night," he said. "Good night," I replied. It should have been nothing, but it wasn't. The next morning, we crossed paths in the kitchen. I reached for a mug just as he set down the coffee pot. Our hands nearly touched. He pulled back quickly, almost too quickly. "Sorry," he said. "No problem," I answered, though my heart was already racing. We stood there for a second too long. Then we both turned away. That night, as rain tapped against the windows and wind curled around the house, I found myself in the garage, pretending to organize old boxes. Richard came out, saying nothing, just stood a few feet away and started sorting through a nearby shelf. For nearly an hour, we worked in silence, never quite facing each other, never quite apart. It was strange how comfort and discomfort could coexist so fully in a single space. As I turned to leave, he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "You don't have to be afraid of this." I froze. Not from fear exactly, from recognition. Because I've been trying to avoid defining this for so long that hearing someone else do it felt like stepping into cold water. "I'm not afraid," I said after a long pause. "I'm trying to do the right thing." He nodded slowly. "And that matters. More than you know." Neither of us moved. The garage light flickered. I took it as my cue to walk away. The following day, Claire called to check in. She sounded tired but happy. I told her everything was fine. I didn't mention the garage. Later that evening, as I folded laundry in the bedroom, Richard passed by in the hallway. He didn't stop, didn't look in. But I could feel it again, that awareness, that invisible thread stretching between us. We were both holding it, neither of us willing to pull, neither of us willing to let go. By the time Claire returned, the thread was still there, hidden beneath conversations, behind smiles, under shared meals. I noticed the way Richard avoided lingering in the same room too long. I did the same, and yet something remained, something we hadn't named but couldn't erase. I began to wonder if the danger wasn't in what might happen, but in what already had, not in a touch, not a word, but in the space we had created, and neither of us knew how to close it. By the time autumn faded into winter, something between us had settled, not resolved, just quieted, as if the silence had grown comfortable wearing its disguise. Claire was preparing for the holiday season with the kind of enthusiasm only she could maintain. Lights, recipes, early gift planning. It brought a necessary energy to the house. Something cheerful, something to hold on to. I welcomed the distraction. Richard remained steady, always helpful, always measured. We spoke casually when needed, about repairs around the house, weather forecasts, the local high school's football scores. Everything normal, everything controlled. But I noticed the way we choreographed our movements. One of us would step aside before the other entered a room. We never stood too close, never sat on the same side of the table. We had mastered the unspoken rules. One evening, while Claire was out shopping, I was in the study finishing up an invoice report. The door was half open. Richard passed by once, then again. The third time, he paused. "You've made things easier," he said quietly. I turned to my chair. "Easier? For Claire? For this family?" I nodded, unsure of what response would be safest. "That's not easy to do," he added, then continued down the hallway. I stared at the open door long after he'd gone. Later that week, Claire suggested we take a weekend trip after the new year. Just the two of us. A cabin in the mountains. No cell service. No distractions. I agreed before she finished the sentence. Maybe space, real, physical space, would help. Maybe it would be enough to reset everything. But I knew better. Distance didn't undo connection. It only dulled the frequency. On the morning we were supposed to leave, a snowstorm swept in fast and hard. Roads closed. Power flickered. The trip was canceled. We stayed home. Claire made cinnamon rolls from scratch, laughing about the mess of flour she left across the kitchen. Richard helped shovel the walkway. Everything was warm, domestic, picture perfect. By evening, the storm had calmed, and the three of us gathered in the living room. A fire burned in the hearth. Claire drifted off on the couch, her head resting gently against a cushion, a blanket wrapped around her. Richard and I sat in separate chairs. The room was quiet except for the soft crackle of burning wood. I sometimes wonder, he said without looking at me, how different life would be if we didn't keep so many thoughts to ourselves. I kept my eyes on the fire. I think we protect people by doing that, I replied. Maybe. Or maybe we protect ourselves. The fire snapped loudly, breaking the quiet. Some things are better unspoken, I said. He didn't argue. Eventually, I stood and draped another blanket over Claire's sleeping form. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. I'm going to call a night, I said. Richard nodded. Good night. The hallway felt longer than usual. In the mirror above the sink, I caught my own reflection and barely recognized the expression in my eyes. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't desire. It was something in between, a tired awareness of a truth too complicated to name. That night, I dreamed of standing on a frozen lake, the surface cracking quietly beneath my feet. No sound, no scream, just slow, widening fractures. When I woke, the house was still. Claire was already up, her voice echoing distantly from the kitchen as she spoke on the phone. Richard had left early to run errands. The space felt clear, but not empty. Later, when I passed by his study, I saw a small note pinned to the inside of the bookshelf. Just a quote, typed on an old typewriter. Some fires burn without flames. You only feel the heat when you try to walk away. I didn't touch it. I didn't ask. Some spaces are meant to stay untouched. Some tensions never find release. They just reshape the silence. And sometimes, the hardest part isn't resisting a line. It's living with the one you never crossed. The one that still burns quietly behind you.